my mind map for Dr. Brown's lecture on historical and current perspectives relating to literacy for Dr. Mann's class, Teaching Reading and Writing Across the Grades. If you take a look, you can see that I organized my map with two functions in mind. At the center, I have a flow chart which shows the linear progression of reading instruction from the turn of the century to current day practices. So that shows the historical perspective. Branching out from the center of my mind map, I have the 8 components of the National Reading Panel's study on the teaching of reading, and I narrowed those down to the 5 that were focused on foremost in the report. So just to zoom in and show you at the beginning early inception of the teaching of reading at the turn of the century, it was taught mainly through English instruction, and that's where we see the use of the New England Primer and McGuffey's Reader. It wasn't until the period between 1914 and 1919 that research showed that English instruction should be separated from reading instruction. So this is really where reading became a subject unto its own, and the importance of the reading teacher in the classroom arose from there as well. So looking at my branches that I have from side to side here, we have oral reading that was going on mostly through the early turn of the century, and then the silent reading began to come into more play as research continued to develop and show new instructional methods. In 1921, we have Thornton's Word Book, which was really an important piece. If reading was going to become its own subject area, then of course it would need a book to go along with it rather than the literature that was used tied into the English instruction. So Thorndike's Word Book came into play there, and that of course was attached to oral reading fluency. In 1937, down here, I put reader's response theory down here, not to separate it out of my timeline, but really just to demonstrate, and I want to come back to this later, this connection between reader and text. Rosenblatt really found that readers construct meaning from text, and text can have different meanings depending on the perspective of the reader. So that was a very important development right there. But going back to the timeline, in the 1940s, we have Dick and Jane's See and Say method of reading instruction, and that, of course, is also connected to oral reading fluency. In the 1950s, Fleisch studied the word method and began to realize that just because students could sound out words and were using the word method, that they sometimes would be guessing words, and this was not necessarily a positive thing for reading instruction and for reading comprehension. So, with Fleisch's studies, we begin to see the development of phonics instruction, which was a very important step along the progression of reading and reading instruction. All right, in the 1960s, Goodman's study revealed that reading miscues were not necessarily a bad thing in oral reading fluency because they did demonstrate a window into reading comprehension. And that connection could be made in my mind map between the reading miscues and the reading comprehension there. All right, as we travel along, in 1967, Charles' work, The Scholarship of Reading, really honed in on reading as an art and demonstrated certain principles that worked best for the teaching of reading instruction. So that is what is represented by this symbol over here. So Chall found that small group instruction worked best, silent reading, the teaching of phonics, and sight word recognition were all very important to reading instruction. And these are so many of the methods that we still use in teaching reading today. In the 1970s, Goodman studied whole language and the use of authentic literature that was child-centered. So again, we really see this focus at this point in the teaching of reading, connecting the reader with the text. That was a big advancement there as well. In the 1980s, we begin to see the division between the instruction of phonics and the teaching of whole language. Two different camps, if you can call it that, that were pitted against one another to determine what was the best method of teaching reading in the classroom. So this became known as the literacy problem, however, because there was a great debate about that. In the 1990s, thank goodness, and this is the period of time where I began teaching, I taught second grade, I remember the reading wars, and thankfully they came to an end when Cunningham discovered that the balanced approach to phonics and whole language was really the best. So finally we have struck this balance between phonics and whole language. So phonics is still an important part of reading instruction. In late 1900s, in 1999, the definition of literacy was broadened beyond reading. After all, students do really need to be literate in so many different areas. If they're watching news programs, or they're looking at political cartoons, or even reading a brochure on a health issue, they have to be able to understand literacy, or be able to use literacy, in many different areas of their lives, and comprehend and take in information, and realize that information can sometimes vary from source to source. So, thank goodness that definition was broadened beyond reading itself. Now, shifting over here, in 1998, the National Reading Panel assesses the effectiveness of reading instruction. And I have this area in green, and I use the color green to highlight the National Reading Panel, and then also anywhere you see text on my branches in green, that means it's a topic that was tied back to the National Reading Panel study. So, connecting to reading comprehension, the National Reading Panel made some suggestions and some revelations that multiple strategies work best in teaching reading comprehension. The connection between reader and text is very important. There has to be a variety of decodable text. Students can't be reading something that is beyond their decoding level because they will get too bogged down in trying to sound out the words, and this is not a good way to assess whether or not they're comprehending the text. So the text has to be at their reading level. The construction of meaning from text is very important. The use of reciprocal teaching from peer-to-peer, teacher to student, and guided reading comes into play here as well. All right, and the distinguishing of shades of meaning is very important to literacy as well, and the National Reading Panel's report certainly takes a look at that, in the use of many different words and their many different meanings. Students have to be able to grasp those nuances in meaning to be truly literate, as it were. Moving over to this branch, I would just like to show, I apologize, vocabulary instruction is certainly tied into reading comprehension. And it was found that through the National Reading Panel study that vocabulary instruction needs to focus not just on the word meanings, but of course word meanings, but not just that. It must be given directly and indirectly. So students can be given a weekly vocabulary list where they have to become comfortable with the words and use them on a daily basis, of course, but they also have to be able to understand and interpret new words as they meet them in the text. And then word recycling was found to be very important as well in the teaching of vocabulary. Students not only have to look at words and memorize their definitions, but they have to encounter these words on a daily, monthly, weekly, yearly basis so that the words become their own. And that's what I always tell my students as well. Use your vocabulary words and make them your own so that you're comfortable with them. All right, so scrolling over here, I just wanted to point out on this part of my mind map that the National Reading Panel found that phonics instruction, which of course is composed of phonics and phonemic awareness, has to be approached systematically. So systematic phonics instruction is very important to the teaching of phonics. And this also came about as a result, really, of the end of those reading wars and the end of the whole language versus phonics debate. Phonemic awareness, of course, is very important as a component of phonics instruction. And the way to best achieve that was thought to be through small groups, mainly, especially at the primary, elementary grades, so that the students are able to see the teacher's mouth, because the formation of words sounds is very important to their phonemic awareness. Invented spellings need to be accepted at the early grades so that the students are getting the sounds down, and this is where the phonemic awareness comes into play. And all this should mostly be done in K to 1, but of course phonics instruction does go beyond first grade. But in terms of teaching phonemic awareness, it needs to be focused in the kindergarten to first grade classrooms. So phonics is important. Of course, we still do silent reading, so that factors in as well. Now, scrolling up here on my mind map, I would just like to show you that oral reading fluency is defined by the National Reading Panel as expression, speed, and accuracy. And of course, students need to have all that in place. And quality instruction in oral reading comes from practice with oral reading, repetition of texts, and feedback from students and peers. It is found that with oral reading, that round-robin reading is not always effective. Actually, studies have shown that smaller groups of shared reading and the repetition and feedback works better in the classroom. It could be peer-to-peer. It could be a student using their 12-inch voice, working with another peer, or it can be small group guided reading instruction. And paired reading, as I pointed out, does work really well. The writing component comes in, and I should have mentioned this earlier, but in the 1960s, the SQ3R directed reading activities really brought about direct instructional strategies for teaching readings. Continuing along and scrolling down to the bottom of my mind map, I would like to mention that as we come into the 21st century, we're certainly not finished with our reading studies, but we've definitely come a long way since the beginning. And thank goodness there is a more balanced approach. And in 2002, of course, we had the seminal legislation on instruction, No Child Left Behind, which is really the cornerstone of a lot of what is being done for education today. In 2011, the Common Core New Jersey Standards in English Language Arts were developed, and they developed these strands of learning: reading, writing, speaking and listening, language, and the use of media and technology. And really, this is so all-encompassing and all-important. I teach junior high English students, and I can definitely see how all these need to mesh together into them becoming 21st century learners and very literate in all areas of their lives. And even the students who are a little reluctant and reticent to read out loud do need to be aware that speaking in front of groups or communicating to people on a more intimate basis, one-on-one, is important, and it's a very huge part of literacy as well. Just to wrap up, over here, I'm a member of the National Council of Teachers of English. It's an organization that was founded in 1911, and the council promotes the development of literacy, the use of language to construct personal and public worlds, and to achieve full participation in society through the learning and teaching of English and the related arts and sciences of language. This is a great resource, a great sounding board. I have found many useful articles, suggestions, ideas through the National Council of Teachers of English, and it's great that we do have these support systems to help us in our reading instruction. So, I hope you enjoyed observing my mind map. I know that I definitely enjoyed constructing it. I found it to be a really valuable tool for learning, and in fact, I'm going to use it a lot more in the classroom for my own instructional purposes and teaching my students. Thank you, and I look forward to talking with you again.